But, welcome back, everybody. And now to extend on the themes that we've explored earlier, let's turn to the first panel of the day, which we've called Anti-Authoritarianism, Building a Legacy for the Future. And what this panel is going to do is going to look at authoritarianism not only as a political force, but as a cultural one that's pervasive, adaptive, and often difficult to recognize, and until it's deeply entrenched. And these are themes that we've already explored today, but drawing on experiences from advocacy, organizing, philanthropy, and the conversation will examine the strategies used to weaken civic institutions, to pull communities apart, while also lifting up examples of resilience, courage, and resistance. It also will ask us to think about legacy. What does it mean to build courage and solidarity in moments like this? How can civic power be nurtured and sustained across generations? We're fortunate to have this discussion guided by a moderator with deep experience and a friend of JANM at the intersection of law, policy, and civil rights. Damon Brown, until very, very recently, was the Special Assistant Attorney General at the California Department of Justice and Chief Legal and Policy Advisor in the Office of California Attorney General Rob Bonta. He's led significant civil rights and voting rights litigation, including work that helped hold the Trump administration in check during the sustained assault on civil rights. He's been part of that incredible network of lawyers and jurists that have been at the vanguard of holding the Trump administration to account. So please join me in handing over and welcoming to our moderator, Damon Brown, who will introduce our incredible panel.
Thank you. Thank you, and good morning, everyone. And just a slight point of clarification, and until 5 o'clock today, I still am with the California Department of Justice and am honored to be here on behalf of Attorney General Bonta, who sends his regards and admiration for this wonderful event and the partnership that we've had with JANM over the years. So good morning and welcome to today's conversation, Anti-Authoritarianism, Building a Legacy for the Future. And I think the title itself of the theme really asks us to do two things. One, to confront the very real authoritarian pressures that are shaping the political landscape today, and to imagine a democratic future that we want to leave behind. And that dual task is not a theoretical exercise. It's happening in courtrooms every day, in classrooms, in cultural spaces and institutions, organizing spaces, and in the everyday decisions that communities are making about truth, belonging, and power. And at the California Department of Justice, I've had the privilege of serving and leading some of the most consequential efforts in the country to push back against authoritarian trends by defending voting rights, civil rights, and vulnerable communities targeted by disinformation and division. And much of that work happens quietly through litigation, through policy, coalition building, but it's absolutely essential and critical to safeguarding our democracy and democratic norms. So today, I'm not just here as a moderator, I'm here with some colleagues, some justice warriors who are in the fight right along with us, and it's my pleasure to now introduce to you our panelists. I have to my left Don Chen, who is the president of the Cerdna Foundation, where he leads one of the nation's oldest family foundations in advancing racial equity and social justice. He previously directed the Cities and States programs at the Ford Foundation and founded Smart Growth America, a national leader in equitable urban policy. He serves as a major leadership roles across philanthropy and impact investing. Thank you, Don, for joining us today. To his left, we have Margaret Huang, who is a nationally respected leader in racial equity, gender justice, human rights, and democratic participation. She is currently a senior fellow at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, advising on how to center racial equity and democratic reform. She previously served as president and CEO of the Southern Poverty Law Center and as executive director of Amnesty International USA. Thank you, Margaret. To her left, we have Scot Nakagawa, who is the co-founder and executive director of the 22nd Century Initiative and one of the country's most seasoned strategists in the fight against authoritarianism. For more than 3 decades, he has worked as an organizer, a political strategist, and movement analyst confronting racist, anti-Semitic, patriarchal, and religious fundamentalist movements. His writing papers in the Anti-Authoritarian Playbook on Substack. Check it out. Scot, thank you for being with us. And we also have Viet Nguyen, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist, cultural critic, and scholar whose work explores memory, war, displacement, and the politics of narrative. His writing and public scholarship illuminate how stories shape power and how communities resist through storytelling, truth-telling, and cultural production. Thank you. And so as we begin, I'd like to kind of set the landscape of where we are now and ground the conversation with looking at the big picture, the state of democracy in this very moment. And so I'll start with Scot. You've written about the clock of democracy and the indicators of authoritarian consolidation. From your vantage point, where are we right now, locally and nationally, and what signs should we be paying more close attention to?
All right. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I consider it a great honor to be here. I think of this as my community. In fact, I don't normally work from notes, but I thought I'd better come correct with these people. So I have some. And I will give you a kind of a temperature check of where things are. The news is not good. You know, I've been a social justice advocate for 47 years now, and I've never seen anything like that. I spent a tremendous amount of that time stewing in worry that this time might come and living in the hope that it would not, but here it is upon us. And so I'm just going to kind of try to check off where we are in the clock of the world. So political scientists tell us that authoritarian takeovers occur in phases. The first is preparation, the second, breakthrough, and the third is consolidation. So we're well past preparation. You know, substantively, intentionally, that began with the first Trump administration. The breakthrough that the Trump's coalition has experienced occurred in the most recent general election, where they were able to take the White House. We are now in the third phase, which is consolidation. This active consolidation phase is not a warning. It's not, you know, just about planning what they're going to do. It's the phase where the consolidation of authoritarian power across all of society is underway. Experts tell us that we have a year to 18 months to stop and reverse consolidation when faced with a breakthrough such as the Trump administration experienced. Keep in mind that's a historical pattern, though not a guarantee. We may have more time, but the point is that time is short. We don't have very much time. And Trump is moving at breathtaking speed. When you look at his peers around the world, other authoritarians, Trump is actually much more quickly than they have historically. 5 markers tell us that this is consolidation, right? The first is mass operations against scapegoated populations have begun. We've all seen it. To give you a sense of this, 3,000 ICE agents are now in Minnesota. Renee Nicole Good was shot and killed January 7th. Another person was shot January 14th. This is occupation-level deployment, normalizing state violence. The second is the emergency power framework that is trying to be deployed here. The Insurrection Act threat is today what Executive Order 9066 was in 1942, the legal-sounding mechanism that makes mass rights violations seem procedurally legitimate. The third is institutional purging, which is well underway. We've already gone through what amounts to an administrative coup at the federal level. Federal bureaucracies are being gutted of anyone suspected of insufficient loyalty, and the goal of all of this is to remove anyone who might slow walk orders, leak or blow the whistle publicly, or otherwise resist within those institutions. The fourth indicator is that dissent is being criminalized. We heard a lot of that earlier, right? And so you all know what the context is. Peaceful protesters are being called insurrectionists. Democratic governors are being accused of terrorism. Authoritarians delegitimate resistance before you prosecute it. The fifth is that the rule of law is collapsing as a constraint against abuses of power. And we all know that's happening, right? When the courts rule against the regime, they threaten to ignore the rulings and sometimes do. When the law constrains them, they invoke emergency powers. If they can get away with this, that opens the door to rule by capricious, self-interested, and kleptocratic, and I emphasize kleptocratic men. That's where we are right now. The process from where we are to what might come next could happen really quickly. And in order to illustrate this, I want to share a historical timeline that I think many here are familiar with, right? December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor was bombed, right? This presented a crisis the Roosevelt administration turned into a trigger moment to reach for power and consolidate their base. By January 29, 1942, prohibited zones were established. February 19, Executive Order 9066 was signed, and in May 1942, forced removal began. So that's 74 days from crisis to mass incarceration. That's how quickly this could go. Today's timeline, of course, January 20, 2025 was the inauguration. January 7, 2026, Renee Good was killed. 8 days later, on January 15, the Insurrection Act is being threatened. So we're at, approximately a year into this process. Really important to keep in mind how many parallels there are between this period and the period of internment, right? The Japanese American community was incarcerated not for anything it did, but for who we were, all justified by military necessity. There were no charges, no trials, there was no evidence. That's openly acknowledged. Just racism laid onto a manufactured threat with full knowledge of the illegality of these actions, the lies they were based on, and the socially and economically devastating consequences that Japanese Americans would face as a result. So very similar dynamics. I just want to say before I concede the stage to someone else, you have to remember the Roosevelt administration was a Democratic one, right? Thinking in nonpartisan, not bipartisan, but nonpartisan terms is critically important here. Unless we hold the Democratic Party in check and continue to make demands and remain vigilant, liberal leaders may abandon or even turn on us, right? FDR gave us the WPA, the TVA, the New Deal, in order to build a base for democratic politics, in order to be able to revitalize the economy of the United States. It waged a war against fascism abroad, but in all of this failed to address the vulnerability to authoritarian populism at home by failing to address issues such as race and gender and civil rights, right? And so we were left vulnerable. Today, immigrants, protesters, democratic officials are being characterized as national security threats. They're under tremendous pressure. The pattern is nearly identical: to turn political opposition into an existential threat requiring extraordinary measures, and then use those measures to cow the population into compliance, right? Today, watch for banking access question for political opponents, property seizures justified by enforcement operations, tax-exempt status revocations. This is economic warfare as political control. So keep all of that in mind, and I'm just going to list a few critical warning signs to watch for. Immediate escalation indicators include surge deployments exceeding 1,000 agents to new cities, right? National Guard federalization without a governor's request, often against the governor's consent, overriding state authority militarily, procurement of detention infrastructure, emergency contracts for facilities, fencing, food service, emergency proclamations declaring insurgent zones or suspending judicial review. Rhetorical escalation, criminalizing new categories, right? Union leaders, journalists, professors, attorneys, activists, you name it. So these are the things to be watching for. These are all triggers of rapid escalation that we should be anticipating. And we should keep in mind that there's a kind of a pattern here that we need to be watching, right? We're going to talk about that more later, so I'm going to stop here. But there is a pattern to be watching, and we can learn from the world what people in other countries around the world have done and what we've done historically here in the United States. All hope is not lost. we have tremendous opportunity here, and we'll talk about that more.
Thank you, Scott. Thanks for that. Framing really does help us to understand not just the urgency, but the trajectory, and that there are flashpoints of having been here once before, at least once before. But I would like to shift the conversation now to talk a little bit about public memory, narrative, and the battle for the truth, because we all know that the truth, facts, are under assault. And authoritarian movements often begin by controlling the story. What is remembered, what is forgotten, and what is distorted. And so, Margaret, your work explores how public memory is shaped by museums, by curators, by communities, and how that memory influences democratic practice. What have you learned about the power of narrative in moments like this?
Thank you, Damon. And like Scott, I'm very grateful to be here and very excited to be part of this conversation. I think many of you in the room know, just as Scott has noted, that this is not the first time that people in the United States have experienced an authoritarian regime. The Japanese Americans in the 1940s certainly experienced that. So did the African Americans across the South for many, many decades. And of course, indigenous peoples in this country have long lived under authoritarian practice. So as Scott said, we have much to learn from our history when we can see and learn about accurate history. There are actually two things I wanted to lift up to all of you that have just come across my attention in the last week. The first was the announcement that it is white Christian men who are truly the victims of discrimination in this country. This was the announcement from President Trump, of course, and his EEOC is now actively seeking cases of white Christian men who they can represent in seeking damages for the discrimination they've faced. The other was a notice yesterday in Philadelphia that the National Park Service has removed all references to the practice of slavery in our country from the national park and the memorial to our origins in Philadelphia. These are just two examples of the rewriting of history that is happening daily, actively right now in the country. And the question for us is, how do we confront this? How do we take steps to preserve accurate memory and to ensure that our future generations don't lose sight of what's really important? The role of the Japanese American National Museum is such an important one in this moment. And like so many other sister organizations, although always at the lead, this museum has really taken on the role of ensuring that the truth is shared. But what I've noticed over the years is that so many of these efforts are done by private institutions. And that's even more so at this moment. When you look at federal funding and state funding that's being removed, taken away from private institutions. And for the last several years, I've been living and working in the South, in the Deep South, in the state of Alabama. Some of you may know that the only museum in the state of Alabama that receives any state funding is the Museum to the Confederacy. Which is why the best museums in Alabama and memorials are completely privately funded. If any of you have had the chance to visit Bryan Stevenson's Legacy Museum and the Memorial to the Victims of Lynching, that they're extraordinary sites that are completely funded privately because there was a recognition that there would be no government funding for those efforts to tell those stories. Recently, the Southern Poverty Law Center undertook a project with a group of academics, museum curators, and activists from Germany and the United States. And we hosted visits to each country to look at what we could learn from public memory sites. In Germany, all of the public memory sites are publicly run. Taxpayers' money is used to fund these sites. And they're heavily researched. They're all government employees who work at the sites, and they're quite extraordinary. We found those sites to be moving and fascinating and accurate in the capturing of German history around the rise of the Third Reich in the early 30s and 40s. What's interesting is that when you talk to some of the other minority communities in Germany, is that there's no discussion publicly about the colonial history of Germany. And that's an interesting question. Why this honesty about the post-World War II era, but zero discussion about the genocide that was committed in many parts of Africa? So it's not the United States alone that has its blind era and blind spots. But of course, when the Germans came to the United States and we took them on tours of Alabama and Georgia to learn from the public memory sites and private memory sites, there was quite a lot of shock at the lack of public acknowledgement of the history of the United States, particularly in the Jim Crow South. And of course, the acknowledgement of the practice of slavery across the South. So, some things to take away from this. How we capture history is really vitally important. There should be federal and state funding and institutions that support the accurate capture of history, but we cannot rely on those agencies to ensure that the stories are told and that the stories of all people who were affected by that history are captured and told accurately. And one other thing that the Germans really noted is in the private telling of history in the United States, there's so much celebration of resistance. When you visit the sites, the public memory sites that have been created by individuals and private institutions, you see a celebration of people who did not simply stand by when things were happening, but who actively fought, who led and taught and encouraged people to stand up. And that's vitally important and not something that publicly funded institutions can often do. So there's some great lessons to learn from history, and it's something I hope we will bring to this moment of discussion.
Thank you. Very powerful. Viet, you've written extensively about how narrative and power intersect. And I'd like for you to talk a little bit about how cultural narratives become tools of both resistance and authoritarian control.
Well, I mean, as we've heard, we're in a moment of a heightened political conflict and authoritarianism and the rise of fascism. And one thing I want to stress here is that we're also in the middle of a culture war. And culture war is inseparable from conflicts over memory and narration and so on, but culture wars are also inseparable from actual wars as well. I'll just use one example, the Vietnam War. I'm very familiar with that. But one thing that happened as a consequence of the Vietnam War is, for a while, and many of these people in this room are old enough to remember this, there seemed to be a lesson that Americans took away from the Vietnam War, which is that was a bad war. We shouldn't do this again. And that has remained something of the cultural memory of this nation, but the political efforts to transform the meaning of the Vietnam War, to transform it into a good war, a failed war, but a noble war that was flawed, has actually been a bipartisan effort on the part of both Republican and Democratic presidents, and it's been successful. The effort to re-narrate the Vietnam War as a good war that could have been fought better with better technology, better strategy, a more diverse military, that has led us into our present moment. That has led us to the Desert Storm. That led us to what we did after 9/11 to turn that moment of victimization into a moment where we become the victimizers and we wage a forever war that has been completely integral with our support for Israel. So I just want to keep on stressing this, that there are all these important political issues that we've been discussing, and I, as a writer, feel kind of humble because, why am I here? And then I think I should not be humble because, in fact, the culture war has been absolutely crucial to the justification of the political and the actual wars that we have fought. And so writers and artists and storytellers and museums have a crucial role to play here. And I'm not simply saying that because I'm a writer. I'm saying that because you can look and see, as Margaret, as you pointed out, there is a war against museums in the United States. There's an attempt to control the narration of the American past, to literally whitewash it, to do what is crucial to authoritarian, fascist, white nationalism, which is to reconstruct the processes of memory and forgetting. All nationalism is a form of memory and forgetting. It's really just a question of what do we remember and what do we forget. And what this administration wants to do, and a lot of Americans want to do, is to forget the basic and fundamental contradiction from which this country is born, which is this country is born from beauty, liberty, democracy, equality, which we're all trying to defend, and it's born from brutality, genocide, enslavement, colonization, and perpetual war, which is not a series of accidents, but in fact, and this is what Americans have a really hard time comprehending, the brutality made the beauty possible. Now, that is the fundamental contradiction that the administration wants to completely eradicate, and it's obvious it wants to construct a white supremacist, Christian nationalist version of the past, which justifies the present. So that's where we're at right now, and that's why art, storytelling, writing matters. And I'm going to end with stressing what that means. It doesn't mean simply the weakest version of this, which is the version of multicultural America. Okay, the diversity, equity, inclusion model of storytelling. Because that's what's got us here in the first place. It gave us, President Obama. Great issue that we had a black president, but he was a black president who authorized drone strikes, and he deported a lot of people. That is part of the problem and the contradiction of multiculturalism that liberals have a hard time getting their minds around, that you can be liberal, you can be multicultural, and you can still wage perpetual war. That is part of what it means to be an American. And given the speeches that we've heard this morning, which were really great, one thing that they stressed is that this issue of complicity in totalitarianism, authoritarianism, that is a bipartisan complicity, and Democrats and liberals have played their role in building an apparatus of complicity. If Democratic presidents blow people up with drone strikes, is that better than Republican presidents blowing people up with drone strikes? And, liberals have failed in being able to confront that. Now, again, back to the storytelling issue, it means that simply having more of our stories, more of our movies, more of our novels with people of color in it is good, but it's not enough. That's what got us a multicultural military. So when we tell stories, I go back to this model of Toni Morrison, black woman, 1970s. She's an editor. She's a writer. She looks around at the literary landscape. She realizes the center is over there, defined as white American literature. And she has a choice. She can move herself to that center, or she can move the center to her by unapologetically telling stories of black people, black history, and black women. That's exactly what she did. And now we live in Toni Morrison's universe. So the lesson to take away from that as storytellers is we have to be unapologetic in our storytelling. We have to put ourselves at the center, and we do not apologize and we do not translate. That is the backbone to the kind of storytelling that we need as artists, but it's also the backbone to the storytelling that we need when we talk about politics and memories of a nation and of a resistance movement as well.
Excellent. And sort of building on what Viet said about the culture wars, I want to dive into sort of the issue of racial equity as a democratic imperative. And I'm going to go back to Margaret again on this one. But authoritarian movements do rely on division, especially racial division, as a core part of their strategy. And so, Margaret, in drawing from your work and the communities that you've engaged with, how do we center racial equity and justice in a way that strengthens and not fragments our democratic response?
So I think if you look at the origins of our democracy and the language of our Constitution, you see what happens when we don't center race and racial justice in the infrastructure of democracy. We had a democracy in this country for many, many years that didn't include all of us. And if we're going to be serious about having a democracy that works for all of us, then we have to rethink the ways in which we are practicing the democracy of our country. Right now, there is an effort underway to litigate our way out of the growing authoritarianism in this country. And while I'm grateful to my colleagues who are leading the litigation struggle and winning, thank you, I also recognize that the judiciary is not going to save us. And I've been told by some of the litigators, we don't have to talk about race in this conversation yet. Let us win some of the, this is not your office, just to be clear. Let us win some of these cases around protecting the constitutional statutes, et cetera, and then we'll get to the issues of race. That will absolutely fail. Racial justice has to be at the center of the fight for democracy. And if it's not, it will lose. You can clap. So how do we do that at this particular moment? And, you know, diversity, equity, inclusion, it makes us all groan at this point because those practices, which were wildly embraced by corporations, which should tell you why they failed, are not what is racial justice. At the heart of racial justice is accountability. And that's why the conversation earlier was so interesting, and I desperately wish we had another 30 minutes for that dialogue to continue. We have to think about mechanisms of accountability for the wrongs that are happening. And we can all see it every day now. What's happening in Minneapolis is fascinating because it is a predominantly white community, but it is going after the people who are perceived by this administration as the most vulnerable, the people who they can ostracize and who they can segment out and deny constitutional rights protection to. And the response of the Minneapolis civic engagement community has been inspiring. Not in our names, not in our backyard, not in our communities. And this is going to have to be the way that the rest of us proceed. If any of you are wondering, what can I do now, right now, as we're contemplating the rise of authoritarianism in this country? Start building relationships locally. Start building networks and infrastructure that will help you when ICE shows up in your community. Now, many of you have already been part of that here in Los Angeles, and bless you for the fight that you led as we kicked this off. But the rest of us are also going to have to deal with this. And we're going to have to find new ways of resistance, as we heard so eloquently this morning. It's not going to be raising signs at a No Kings protest a couple of times a year. When researchers went back to Germany and looked at how everyday Germans responded to the rise of the Third Reich, apparently about 3% of them were actively involved in Nazi activities. 3%. 90% were bystanders. That's the biggest risk. We cannot be bystanders. We cannot hope that somebody else is going to take up the cause, and we can't wait for people to come in and save us. We are the people we've been waiting for. And so that's the moment that we're in, where we have to recognize that solidarity and community are the ways that we will defeat this effort. And it starts yesterday, but at least today.
Thank you. And to the point that you raised, Margaret, about accountability, I also want to sort of center some of the work that we were doing through the Department of Justice in supporting the reparations task force. And that is a prime example of where we saw that cross-racial solidarity, where the Japanese community came and have been probably the largest standard bearers for the for reparative justice for African Americans. And it is not something that has gone unnoticed on the national scene, that it takes others who don't look like the ones seeking redress for the harm to jump in the fight, not through rhetoric, but to actually be on the lines fighting just as hard for the justice that's due. And we've seen that in the reparations context in a cross-racial way, and we need to see that again going forward now in this critical moment. I'd like to pivot slightly to looking at this within the global context. And authoritarianism, as we know, does not exist in isolation. It's part of a global pattern. And I'd like to turn to Dawn for a moment and ask you to talk a little bit about the fact that, as was mentioned earlier, many Asian American communities have direct memories of authoritarian regimes. And so how does that lived experience shape political engagement today?
Thanks. It's also such an honor for me to be here, particularly this institution, JANM. So appreciative of the leadership and the community. I think let's do a show of hands. How many of us have experienced authoritarianism in our lifetimes, or our parents, the generation before us? Direct experience. And not everyone here, of course, is AAPI in this audience, but folks who happen to come from that part of the world have experienced this. And to Scott's point earlier, it's not ideological. It's not always right-wing authoritarianism. It also came from the left wing. It came from all points of the spectrum. And so this is a reminder. It's fresh. When we talk about memory, it's not something that we need to conjure up through history books. It is something that people remember directly. And I think that's incredibly valuable, and it speaks to why JANM has been such a leaderful institution in this moment. I'm particularly enthusiastic about the role that Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders can play. And a recent trip of mine to Hawaii reminded me there are plenty of examples in the Pacific Islands as well of authoritarian rule and takeover, and what we can bring as allies to the challenge. As someone who runs a foundation, we are one of the oldest family foundations, or one of the oldest foundations in America. We have an opportunity to, we have a tremendous latitude. Our foundation has chosen a set of priorities, like just about every foundation. We have latitude, and we've chosen to focus on racial justice. We haven't actually explicitly focused on democracy, authoritarianism, but as we started to experience the rise in recent years, going way back to 2014, is when we started on our journey. We realized that there's no way in this country, as a social justice foundation, that we can address this work adequately without addressing race directly. That's why our mission is to advance racial justice. And secondly, every strategy that we pursue, there's a theory of change. Those of you who've written grant proposals to foundations, you have to write about your theory of change. There's foundations ask, how are you going to change things? How are you going to make the world a better place? And every single strategy is predicated on this assumption that there's a working democracy, that things will function, that there's a rule of law, etc. And so for our foundation, it's been incredibly plain to see that these are things that we need to fight for, even if we don't have existing programs that have been dedicated to these things. So we actually look at, with that latitude, we're able to look at arts and culture, memory, storytelling, movement organizing, movement infrastructure, and make choices about how to adjust our priorities to meet the moment that we're in right now. And we're doing that along with so many others. One other thing I'll say is that I have been encouraged. I've been an admirer of Scott's analysis and work for years, and his Substack is really something you should check out. And a lot of what we see is so dark, and at the same time, there are points of light. And my friend Tanya Allen, who runs the McKnight Foundation in Minneapolis, just posted a blog post that says that what's happening in Minneapolis is the worst and the best of America, because we see people coming to each other's aid, parents and pastors, business people, business owners, restaurant owners. They're coming together to oppose what we see, the craziness that we see there. And there's an article in the Atlantic this week, and I love the way this article begins, because it starts talking about 2025 as annus horribilis. Of course, annus spelled ANNUS, but to reflect on the fact that we've had a terrible year, and after a year we can look back and realize that despite all the terrible things that have happened, folks are fighting back to a degree, and that needs to be encouraged. And as a foundation that's able to that has a lot of latitude, we can certainly support folks in the short term, support mutual aid, support training, support efforts to make sure that people understand what's going on, tell stories, shape the narrative. And one thing that we really need to do is to also build that long-term infrastructure, the base building, the very long game that a lot of people feel like we just don't have time to deal with right now. So long-term, short-term, those are priorities that we're really constantly trying to balance. And in the meantime, I think more and more foundations are also starting to speak up, which is very unusual because foundations tend to stay in the background. Most of them don't really like to draw a ton of attention to themselves, with some exceptions. But the fact is, it is time for us to speak out because we can and we must.
Thank you. I'd like to throw the next question to both Viet and Scott to talk a little bit about international movements and how they may inform strategies that we need here, and how should we understand the links between trends that we see here in the U.S. and abroad as it relates to authoritarianism.
Okay. Mark Carney's speech was brought up this morning by Agnes Callamard, and when I listened to his speech or read it, he was talking about the necessity of the middle powers to form sort of a new coalition out there. I was like, what happens if you're not a middle power? Where do the non-middle powers and where do the non-hegemonic powers fall into this? And I thought to an earlier moment of history, which is, of course, the Bandung Conference. These are the non-aligned African Asian nations during the last moment of Cold War conflict. And Bandung Conference and the Afro-Asian Solidarity, this was a movement about decolonization and national liberations throughout the world that found their corollaries within the United States. And these movements were always inseparable. And the moment that activists and writers and everyday people could make those connections, that was the moment when one degree of radicalization led to an even greater degree, and a much more threatening degree of radicalization, as people realized that, in fact, you have to pursue local national movements of liberation and resistance, but when you do so and you pursue them to their logical conclusion, they connect you to the global movements of liberation that are taking place elsewhere. And so when Mark Carney talks about middle powers, I mean, the liberal part of me says, "Oh, good, yes, that sounds logical." But then the more critical part of me thinks, "Wait a minute, this is going to be another reestablishment of the so-called international rules-based order that got us into trouble in the first place because it's an inconsistent application," as Agnes Callamard pointed out. And a middle powers-based coalition is not going to save us from what the great powers order got us into in the first place, which was the destruction of the rules-based order in places like Palestine, but in other places as well, where what was made evident is that the rule of law is determined by the powerful. And Donald Trump, the one thing that he's made very clear is that the naked expression of power that he wants was always the underlying claim of the rules-based order in the first place. Now, that's a very difficult recognition to get to. But we've had other moments of recognition throughout our history. So again, going back to the Vietnam War example, you look at someone like Martin Luther King Jr., very threatening man, investigated as a communist by the FBI in the 50s. He was not a communist. He was an advocate for civil rights and black empowerment. But when the Vietnam War happened, he became an anti-Vietnam War activist, and he was able to connect black liberation and black empowerment with anti-imperialism. And he said very explicitly in his speech Beyond Vietnam that the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. It is guilty of racism, militarism, and extreme materialism. when he started to make these kinds of connections between what the United States was doing overseas and what it was doing domestically, that was, I think, the moment when he really became a really threatening figure to the domestic order of the United States, because he threatened not only the racial order of hierarchy in the United States, but he pointed out that racial order was inseparable from American imperialism overseas. And poor black men are, in his words, are being sent overseas to Vietnam to fight a racist war in brutal solidarity with white soldiers. They're finding equality in a racist moment. That kind of contradiction is what is revealed when we start to make the international and the national connections, which is why I think that we have to look well beyond sort of the liberal middle power response to what we're seeing today and thinking about what kinds of anti-imperialist, what kinds of anti-racist, what kind of anti-authoritarian movements we can build between the 3% domestically in the United States and what's happening globally. And the last thing I'll say is I've thought so much about what you said, Margaret, about this 3% issue and the 90% who stood by the side. And I just want to bring it back to this context of Asian America, because I've thought a lot about this. I thought, how have we gone from the Asian American movement of the 1960s, which was radical, anti-racist, anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, to the moment where it's like, being Asian American is like, we have the Asian American, I'm going to say, we have the Asian American Foundation, and like that is supposed to be our moment of inclusion, is like we want to cozy up to the powers that be. That's what Asian American empowerment is. I'm sorry, Don, if I'm putting you in an uncomfortable situation, but like that's not it. So I think back to the fact that part of the problematic arc of Asian America is that it's gone from being sort of Asian American radicalism as a minority movement to Asian Americans wanting to be a part of the majority, which gets us, what, Kash Patel. Oh, hey, we have the FBI director. It's an Asian American. Awesome. We made it. But I go back to this fact that what was empowering about Asian Americans in the 1960s is that they were always a minority. I mean, I'm pretty sure that if you go back to 1968, it was like less than 3% of Asians in the United States identifying as Asian Americans. We've lost that in the pursuit of this idea that a greater amount of Asian American assimilation is better for us. Well, that may be a necessity, but the idea is that basically we have to go back to this idea when it comes to Asian American politics and this space of JANM and the memories that it evokes and the history that it wants to build. We still need to go back to this idea that there's going to be a 3% Asian American radical movement that's going to lead the way beyond what the mainstream of Asian America might be willing to tolerate.
First I want to just quickly point out that the Vietnam War is a really critical event in the sequence of events that led us to this moment, right? The core of Trump's base, the most loyal supporters, white nationalist paramilitaries, right, began to move to white nationalism and to develop the kind of capacities they have today, in part in response to the Vietnam War, and their sense that American military personnel were emasculated on the global stage by the loss in that war, right? And so they decided to bring the war home. There is, in fact, a book called Bring the War Home that I would strongly recommend you read that tells that story. So just really important to keep in mind that, history works in very odd ways. We need to be tracking all of these things and recognize there's always a downside to everything, right? And then here's your, I feel like we need a dose of hope here. I also, mentioned earlier that the process of consolidation can go very quickly. It could also be extremely complicated for the Trump administration because we have a number of advantages here in the United States that countries around the world, places like Poland, for example, don't have. And one is our federal system, right, which gives states and municipalities way more room to fight. So it's not just taking over one government, but kind of taking over like 50 mini governments and thousands, literally, of other jurisdictions in order to be able to fully consolidate power. And the other is that Trump is terribly unpopular, right? Which is not generally true of autocrats who take over in elections. 80% approval rating is not unusual in that context. So Trump's numbers constitute something very important for us to keep in mind as an advantage. And then the other is that we have a really robust civil society here. Lots and lots and lots of organizations, right? Well-funded organizations. There's much investment there. I want to say, though, as a caution, that we can't simply rely on nonprofits. In fact, we cannot win this fight through nonprofits, right? This has to be an all-of-society fight. In the work that I do on the ground with the most successful nonprofits operating locally in different municipalities and states, I think of them as kind of the inside game. They have a relationship with the mayor. They have a relationship with the governor, elected officials at all levels of government. And so, I think of them as being able to deploy an inside game, but the outside game is us, right? It's all of us, whether we're affiliated with organizations or not, taking action. And those actions can really make a big difference. So speaking to this global pattern, I just think, what matters most in studying what's happening around the globe to me as an organizer is that authoritarian consolidation follows predictable patterns all over the world. And so does successful resistance. So we can learn from each of these contexts, right? So here's what I mean. In Serbia under Milosevic, the Philippines under Marcos, Chile under Pinochet, Poland under martial law, we see the same playbook being deployed again and again. Target a scapegoated group to manufacture crisis, use that crisis to claim emergency powers, deploy security forces against civilian populations, criminalize dissent as terrorism or insurrection, and purge institutions of anyone who might resist, right? That's what they do. Authoritarians around the world all read from the same playbook. They talk to one another. They cooperate globally. And so the playbook looks really similar from place to place. But there are movements that have won against these authoritarians, and here's what we can learn from them, right? First, they identified the pillars of support of authoritarian power. So the church, the military, business, etc. And they undermined those pillars. They weakened them. They drove defections from them in order to be able to put themselves in a much stronger position to compete for power. Milosevic, for example, fell because miners walked off the job. Police refused orders. State media workers leaked footage. Bureaucrats slow-walked directives. These are the kinds of things that work, right? When movements, in order for them to win, we need to be thinking about those pillars and how we interact with them in order to divide them, to weaken them, and to get people to actually reject them, right? So the second is that they use sustained non-cooperation, not just protests. So we should think of protests in this context as defense and non-cooperation as offense, right? Protest is important. It is a very important thing. It also plays a cultural role. We need to claim the cultural landscape. We need to claim every inch of it that we can. We need to preserve cultural memory. We need to do all of these things, and big public events can contribute to that and also demonstrate to ourselves how many we are, that we are not alone, right? But what is necessary for us to do at this point, we've already demonstrated we can move millions, is to start to think about what those millions are doing and get them into non-cooperation mode. So again, bureaucrats slow-walking orders, for example, police blowing the whistle, ICE agents quitting and walking off the job and telling their stories. These are the kinds of things we need. And so, think about strikes, think about boycotts, think about all of those things that allow us to be able to exercise the power we have, which is tremendous. The third is that they built coalitions that transcended ideology. So it's not just all one thing, right? They built cross-ideological coalitions and also diverse coalitions. Poland's Solidarity, United Factory Workers, Catholic priests, intellectuals, and farmers. These were groups that disagreed on almost everything except one thing. Martial law must end, right? In Serbia, the Otpor movement, which is a student movement, brought together nationalists and progressives. The lesson there is you don't need ideological unity. You need a broad enough coalition that the regime can't function without somebody's cooperation, and enough of those somebodies to refuse, right? So that is also really, really important. In addition to that, cultural diversity makes a big difference. Having a positive, future-oriented message, focusing on freedom and reminding people what it feels like to be free, those things matter too. And then another thing, which is centering women's leadership in movements. It is simply just the global record demonstrates that movements that center women's leadership are more successful, in part because they're able to maintain nonviolent discipline better, but there are many other reasons. We need to think of the pillars of support that I talk about. It's not just political or economic, but also cultural, right? And on the cultural front, one of the pillars is the traditional family, right? It's one of the places we learn to bow to authoritarianism and actually to consider it a virtue. And so consider the role of women in society and make sure we create platforms for leadership and give women authority in movements. The fourth is that they use ridicule and humor very strategically. Portland has been doing this, Portland where I'm from, right? With the inflatables and all of this other stuff that's happening, the naked bike ride past the ice center. Things of that sort make a really big difference because they deflate the kind of pomp and, whatnot of the authoritarian. It's super important to keep this in mind. So going back to Otpor again, that student movement in Serbia, they spray painted a barrel with Milosevic's face on it. And keep in mind that at this point, Milosevic was considered untouchable. He was just inevitable to people, right? And then they charged people 1 dinar to hit it with a bat, right? So, then police tried to arrest the barrel. And they got all of this on video, which made them look absolutely absurd, right? So ridicule strips away the fear that authoritarians require, and our movement needs more of this. So think about comedians, think about humor, think about all of those things. They're critically, critically important. All of those things I think we can learn. Remember that the history of this community, those of you who are Japanese American, we know that resistance is possible, even under the most difficult circumstances, and that we can actually succeed in these situations. Even after internment, people were able to come back. They were able to fight for, to recover from that. So just never, ever underestimate the power that we have collectively and that we each have individually, because we have a lot of it, right? A lot of it. So here's something else I want to just share with you before I let go of the mic. So Tarso Ramos, who as a consultant for the Democracy Fund has done some research that reveals that about 7.5 to 8% chance of winning if we only act within the institutions, right, only through channels, that we have about a 7.5 to 8% chance of defeating this attempt at consolidation. If mass movements get involved, if mass civil resistance is deployed, the odds go up to about 51%, right? So that's a lot better, yeah, but probably not good enough. But if unions get involved, if organized labor gets involved, and I mean really robustly, the odds can go up over 80%, right? So yeah, we got to get labor involved, but think about what that means as a lesson about your power. It's because their banks, their businesses, their all of it can't run without us. We are more than 60% of the flow through the economy, we as consumers. If we withhold those dollars, we can divide these coalitions, these authoritarian coalitions, because I'm going to remind you of the word I said earlier, kleptocracy. Many of them are just there because of this, right? Money and power. And so, you can divide these coalitions and push people out of position by doing this. In the Philippines, what did they do? Among all the different things, they organized a run on the state-owned bank. When that happened, liquidity dried up. Many members of that coalition were like, okay, it's nice to know you, but time for you to go. And then Ronald Reagan basically opened the door for Ferdinand Marcos to leave the Philippines and land in Hawaii, where I was living at the time. It was a mess. But anyway, so you have a lot of power, and you should just keep that in mind and hold on to that truth.
Wonderful. I want to pivot a little bit, and this is open to any of the panelists, but I think it's important for us to be able to understand the damage and accepting that we are forever changed, but to the hope point, I think that's what we have to hold on to. And so we're not just analyzing authoritarianism, we're living through the consequences. And so I asked the panel, what aspects of our democracy have been permanently altered? And what does it mean to accept that we cannot simply just go back? ways that I know, and this is sort of something that we've seen at the Department of Justice, is balancing one's survival with the moral imperatives of what binds us and the values that drive us. You see a lot of the capitulation happening with law firms, with businesses who are tied to funding that is now being threatened for withdrawal. And so I think this has been one of the times, probably in a lot of instances, where people have experienced this for the first time, where their survival has been threatened by not capitulating to policy demands from the federal government. And so when we know that that card is on the table, how do we move forward, organize ourselves, edify ourselves to be able to withstand a tweet overnight that could mean the elimination of funding for your entire programming if you don't abide by this latest edict that's come out of Washington. I think knowing that so many of these cards are now on the table, again, whether a Democrat is in office or whether a Republican is in office, this administration has shown you can flex your powers in this way. You might win some, you might lose some, but nonetheless, it does alter the movement that people and the decisions that people are making in their everyday lives. And I feel like that there has to be a recognition of that, not an abandonment of trying to reverse the clock and to step in and to do what's necessary, but to recognize that in many ways, the country has changed. What we know to be possible has changed and must change the way that we think and strategize. And how do we help communities process the trauma that they're experiencing, the disillusionment that's happening, and how do we move forward knowing that what our concept is of what this country is in many ways might be broken or fractured.
Crack at answering your question. You asked us about damage. You asked us about permanent change. I don't think anything is totally permanent, but I think we've experienced a very significant setback on a bunch of different fronts. And I want to go back to what Anne said this morning about the fact that memory it could be nostalgia, but really it's an active practice, and it's a practice that can lead us out of some of this, and incredibly essential. And I think one of the things that we've seen, I mean, this is a week for, saying goodbye to a lot of things. We're saying goodbye to the post-war order, global order. We're saying goodbye to a huge amount of trust in government, and you name it. But if we are able to imagine a better future, something that, frankly, if sweeping away norms, really shaking trust and faith in institution. It is terrible in the moment, but it's also an opportunity to reimagine what those could be in the future. And so, that's what I meant earlier by, we must focus on some of the short-term defense and survival that we have before us, but also really be thinking about that long-term vision. Many of us are friends with Ai-jen Poo, who created and led the National Domestic Workers Alliance. She's written an essay which I found very inspiring about the three Earths that we're occupying. Different people are on different Earths. The first Earth is basically where we've been in the past, and that is where, it's like, the reality of the U.S. up until pretty recently. Where we think we have rule of law and a lot of democratic norms and whatnot, even though we all acknowledge it was never perfect. The second Earth is really the authoritarian state that we're experiencing right now. And a lot of people who are adhering to the rules and the tools of the first Earth are not succeeding in the second one. And at the same time, she says, we really need to be striving for this third Earth, which is completely reimagined, and we need to think about how to create it and build that pathway while we're trying to, deal with the short-term circumstances. So that's what gives me hope. Hope we can get there.
So offer this. I don't know about what can be preserved and what cannot. I do know that we have a constitution that people often describe as this beautiful document that is actually full of holes and flaws that have opened the door to this moment, and that we've relied far too heavily on norms as opposed to rules. And so that's something to think about going forward. But I want to point out that our first keynote today talked about how basically democracy is no longer fit for purpose to a certain class of people here in the United States and the world. And I agree with that assessment, right? I also agree that, the authoritarians have basically really cagily positioned themselves in this moment by anticipating that where we are now is in a process of kind of paradigm shift, away from the way we used to do governance globally to something different, right? They anticipated that coming out of the Cold War. They recognized that they could ignite culture wars in order to divide us. They recognized that this would be necessary in order to create the kind of basis that they needed to be able to move a minority coalition forward and start to seize majoritarian power. They, many of the people that were faced with benefited from neoliberal policy in that era, right? Neoliberal policy, which insulated markets from democratic and corporations from democratic decision making and allowed huge amounts of wealth and power to be accumulated in the hands of very few people, right? They now want to permanently insulate that wealth and power by taking democracy down completely. It's why it's so easy for Trump to put together a coalition that has so many different kinds of people in it, oligarchs, who you would have thought in another context might have behaved in a more liberal way. This is what we're facing. And so we really need to be future forward. We need to recognize that criticism is important, is very important. It helps us to understand where we are in the world. But in order to get anywhere, we need to have a vision of the future. And for that, we need not just critics, but prophets, right? And so we need to be willing to engage in that kind of prophecy, to think about how to move ahead beyond this moment. The past is led inevitably almost to now. Think about the war on drugs, right? Think about tough on crime, the targeting of black communities in order to create the infrastructure for mass incarceration, the racialization of immigrants coming into this country, the racialization and demonization, moving from immigration limitation to total outright bans on the basis of the idea that Mexican immigrants, in particular Latino immigrants, were criminal by nature, right? These historical acts, these processes that we've gone through led us to this moment and also created the infrastructure for this administration to be able to crack down on us in remarkable ways. The surveillance state that they've been able to build, all of it, hugely contingent upon racism, right? So we can't go back to that. So I would say that the more important thing for us to do is to be thinking about what we need to do in the future. Yes, we need to protect our democratic institutions and the leaders within them. That's really important. Movements must protect those people, right, when they do the right thing. But we also need to try to anticipate where we're going next and not try to cling to a past that we cannot return to, structurally impossible. And instead try to imagine what the future might look like, what might be different, right? Doesn't mean that we need to have the answer in this moment. People don't need to know how the sausage gets made. They just want to know it's delicious, right? So we can inspire them by making our demonstrations and movements fun, places to be, places of joy, places of reclamation, places of memory, all of those things. But the future is where it's at. And it's also, it polls better.
As we close, I would like to just sort of pose this last question to Viet and Margaret, if they could close us. As Scott was talking about moving forward, and Don mentioned about sort of our collective imagination and shared responsibility. We have a wonderful, beautifully engaged audience here. What would you suggest, and what could you ask them, one thing that they could do within this next year to strengthen democracy? If you could think of one thing, what would that be?
I think that when we've heard the word loss mentioned a few times, and I think in order for us to feel loss, we had to have had something. We had to have built something beautiful. We had to have made certain kinds of changes and advancements in American culture and politics over the last 50 years, 100 years, for us to feel loss. That's the positive side of looking at it. And when I want to spin it this way because, I'm a writer, so I'm not going to speak about the politics and the strategy, and I'm just totally unqualified for that. But I strongly believe that part of the loss that we feel is made possible because we've been able to build these diverse and beautiful cultures, and that's been involved all of us. Some of us have been writers and artists and storytellers and novelists and movie makers and so on, and some of us are restaurateurs, and some of us are building museums, and all of us have built our cultures and our little Saigons and our little Tokyos and so on. This has been a mass collective effort, and some of it has been driven by ideology and by strategy, but a lot of it's just been driven by people living their everyday lives, for better and for worse. And I draw hope from that, because now that we have a sense of loss, we know that we can rebuild. We can imagine this new future, and the beauty of it is that it's unpredictable. But the beauty of it is actually that it requires us to be able to tell stories. And there's something tremendously empowering for me as a writer in knowing that we as human beings need not just the politics and the government and the law and the jobs and the capitalism. We need the beauty and the arts and the cultures and the stories as well. And we all participate in that. So if there is anything for you to do, and not all of you are professional storytellers, those of you who are professional storytellers, my challenge to you is, can you figure out the new forms that we need? We need new political and legal forms, but we also constantly need new forms of storytelling that are unapologetic and that don't translate and that force audiences that come to us. Each of us as artists and storytellers has to challenge ourselves to think of the form that we need. But for the rest of us who are not professional storytellers, we know that we're embedded in communities where we can facilitate these acts of storytelling, whether it's through joyful protest or whether it's through helping to enforce and to build places like the Japanese American National Museum, or whether it's through building new kinds of community forms that don't exist. And this is, not all of us want to be out marching the streets and so on, but when we look out and we see that there's an absence out there, we can build something in that absence. Don knows, he helps to fund one of my organizations, the Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network. 30 years ago, we looked around, we saw there's not enough people supporting Vietnamese art, so we built that into the nonprofit that is now, it's sort of like, wow, we're a nonprofit, and now it's not as relevant. But nevertheless, there was an absence, and we went in and we built something. And I think now that we look around at this new set of challenges that we have, each of us can figure out how to build and create something beautiful based on our own talents.
I love the calls to building, and especially the use of culture and joy and laughter to do that. And I wanted to share with all of you, so my new role at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, which is a very old organization founded at the beginning of the civil rights movement to bring together civil rights groups, unions, and people of Jewish organizations together to fight for civil rights in the country. My role is to think about the third Reconstruction. And for those of you who know the history, the first Reconstruction happened after the Civil War and brought us the incredible public education system that we have in this country, where formerly enslaved folks recognized that everyone in the country deserved access and a right to quality education, and transformed this country into a more functioning democracy after that terrible, terrible crisis. The second Reconstruction was in the 50s and 60s with the civil rights movement that gave us the legacy of the Voting Rights Act, which will be completely eviscerated within the next 5 months, and the Civil Rights Act, and the immigration reform bill that actually helped transform the immigration system. Those were all efforts that came out of a second Reconstruction, acknowledging that we were not the democracy we should be. So we are at a moment where we have to start building the third Reconstruction. And if you're invited to think about how you would change our democracy, how you would center racial justice and equity for all people in this country in a reconstituted form of government and civil society, what would it look like? And what I invite each of you to do as you leave today is to think about how you share that vision with other people in your community, how you invite those conversations. Because the biggest enemy, the biggest tool that our enemy has is to cause demoralization and to cause fear and a sense of hopelessness. But if we can dream about the kind of country and society we want to be and share that with others, we can absolutely win. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to give a round of applause to Don and Margaret and Scott and Viet for a wonderful and engaging panel today. Thank you to Anne and Jim for this opportunity. And let's remember that democracy is not defended by accident. It's defended by people who show up, who engage, who stay curious, and who stay connected. So thank you for the time today.